Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pave's 112th virtual panel. My name is Tara Andringa, and I'm the Executive Director of Pave. Today, we are excited to have a conversation about AVs and insurance. We've had some prior conversations about this topic, and today we're broadening that conversation in two ways. First, we wanted to talk to a state insurance officer to hear a public sector voice about how they're approaching this issue and challenges that they are facing. We also wanted to hear from stakeholders outside of the United States about how other countries are approaching this and lessons learned. With that, I would love to welcome our expert panelists who will bring a wide range of perspectives that will help us to understand the broad landscape of this topic. First, welcome Russ Galbraith from the Arkansas Insurance Department, who will share his perspective as a state government official in the United States. Rebecca Marsden is the Vice President of Risk and Insurance from AXA, who will share the perspective of an AV company based in the UK and share her insights into recent developments there. Tony Cotto is the Director of Auto and Underwriting Policy for the National Association of Mutual Insurance Companies, or NAMIC, who will share a national perspective of his members, which are insurance companies across the US. And Mike Nelson is the founder and chairman of Quantiv Risk, also on Pave's board, and he brings his unique perspective in understanding liability in the era of automated driving. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We have a lot to discuss. We also got a lot of questions from the audience from at least 4 different countries, so we'll include as many of those as we can get to. First, we want to lay the foundation of this conversation by helping the audience to understand a little bit about each of your perspectives at a high level. Russ, I would love to start with you. Since you're the first official from a state insurance department that we've had on a Pave webinar, wanted to just start with a general question to kick us off. Insurance could basically cover anything, pardon the pun there, but wondered if you could provide an overview of the work that the Arkansas Insurance Department does and how you're thinking about the introduction of AVs onto Arkansas's roadways.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and what a great honor to be one of the first insurance regulator on this particular webinar. So thank you very much. In Arkansas, our statutory and philosophical mission is to protect consumers, monitor and examine insurer solvency, and deter and prosecute fraud. That's in our mission. That's in our statute. We do that by protecting consumers. We approve rates and forms. We analyze and look at new products that companies bring in. We license agents. We license adjusters, and we hold companies accountable for their actions when it comes to how they treat consumers. From an insurance solvency standpoint, we have our financial our finance division that examines companies periodically, making sure that they're solvent and that they're taking care of the things they need to take care of. When it comes to deterring fraud, we have a fraud unit that is law enforcement that goes after people who commit fraud. Insurance fraud is a $100 billion issue for Americans every year, so it's a huge deal. So those are our 3 major things that we look at, and that's all part of regulating the insurance industry in Arkansas. We've been thinking about autonomous vehicles pretty intently. I've been at the department since 2015, and since then we've made a number of trips to different places to look at the technology. The NAIC, which is the National Association of Insurance Commissioners that all regulators are a part of, took a trip out to California to look at Google X's technology and their autonomous vehicles at the time. So we kind of get an idea of how those things work. We're also, we monitor, the innovation that is within this space, but also the mishaps and the issues that have been going on with it that have kind of deterred the growth of this sector too, and that obviously brings out some concerns. From our standpoint in Arkansas is a relatively, for your international viewers, Arkansas is a relatively small state. We've got about 3 million people. We're pretty rural. We've got a lot of hills, and trees and that sort of thing. So there's not a whole lot of people out here testing the autonomous vehicles. You know, that's out in Nevada and Arizona and places like that. But we do have a company you may have heard of called Walmart, and Walmart has been testing trucks in different areas, but also within Arkansas on a short drives with completely autonomous trucks. And so the legislature passed some things back in 2020 to allow for that type of stuff to happen. So we are in the mix. It's just we're relatively small when it comes to that compared to some of those larger states.
Fantastic. And it's funny, so if you started in 2015, it's probably fascinating to see how much the landscape has changed in those 9 years.
Absolutely.
Tony, I want to turn to you. NAMIC has been engaged in this discussion of liability insurance for AVs for many years now. I just wondered if you can talk a little bit about your organization. Who are your members and what are the interests in the AV space?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tara. Always good to be with fellow insurance folk, and the partnership with regulators like Russ is just invaluable to our members. So NAMIC represents about 1,500 insurance companies. Always happy to say we represent both the smallest carrier in America and the largest carrier in the United States in the property casualty space. Focused primarily on mutuals, so non-publicly traded insurance companies. A lot of farm bureaus, the sort of Main Street American insurance companies. And we all, at the same time, represent 7 of the top 10 auto insurers. So chances are, in the future, if an automated vehicle is involved in a crash, it's going to involve a NAMIC member policyholder. Insurers are also looking at this as a business opportunity because in 49 states, if you have something on the road, it has to be insured. These vehicles are expensive, and when they're involved in crashes, those crashes are going to be expensive, and they're going to need appropriate coverage. So, you know, one of the great untold stories, unfortunately, is how much the insurance industry over the last 50 years has done for road safety, and how much we continue to do for road safety and invest in road safety. So when we look at AVs from NAMIC's perspective, we're not anti-technology. We're not anti-AVs. We're not anti-development of any of this. But it needs to be done safely. It needs to be done in a financially responsible manner. And it needs to be focused on what can and cannot be covered. And some of the dynamics of the Department of Insurance talking to the DMV, talking to the transportation cabinet in a state. Those are things that historically have been challenges. I know when I was a regulator in Kentucky, it would take me weeks to get a response from the DMV because they're going, well, who's the insurance department? I don't care. There's a lot of things that are going to be happening in this space, and I think happening more and more quickly as we hope that more and more government agencies can coordinate and get us all to where we want to be. I also think there's a little bit of, I don't want to pour cold water on anything, but in a real world scenario, like let's say all of the projections are right, and 10 years from now, there's 4 million AVs on the roads in the US. That's still fewer than 1% of cars. So how do we share the roads in a responsible way? And I'm sure Mike will speak to this some too. And like, what are the nightmares of liabilities when you have like a 4-car crash? One of them's an AV, one of them's an electric vehicle, and how do we figure out fault and who's paying for it? Like, these are all the unanswered questions that we're trying to help address. So hopefully we'll tease out some of that today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tony, and the great work that NAMIC's doing. Mike, and you bring incredible expertise as someone who's been focused on understanding the way that liability is changing. Can you, and Quantiv Risk is also really unique. Can you talk a little bit about the work you do, you know, Quantiv Risk, what your focus is and you know, your background?
Sure. My background is I started my career off as an insurance claims adjuster and then an insurance executive, and then later on became a lawyer focused predominantly on the insurance world. What Quantiv Risk is about, and that sprung from our work dealing with legal issues on these type of vehicles. is harvesting data from vehicles. And while we're talking about new car technology, make no mistake about what we're talking about, a big part of this is going to be data. So we harvest the data from vehicles, and we make objective findings about what happened in an accident. And while a lot of our clients are insurance companies, we do work for automotive companies and plaintiff firms, because at bottom, we're an objective party, and it's not like we're going to make a decision about who's at fault. We're simply going to point out what the data in the car, and by data, I also mean video, reflects what happened. So we're able to take data and video and more or less, in close to near time, creates understandings of what took place. And that's going to lead to a lot less confusion about who bears responsibility and how to deal with transferring risk. So that's what quantum risk is all about.
Wonderful, thank you. Rebecca, also, we're thrilled to have you here to provide an international perspective on this discussion from an AV company that's based in the UK. And AXA's doing incredible work. Could you just first tell us a little bit both about your role and also a little bit about AXA?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. So pleasure to be here. I'll reiterate that the comments my fellow panelists have made. Obviously, always a pleasure to be engaging in these really important conversations. So also such a privilege to have the breadth of insight from the different sectors as well. You know, we're very much part of an ecosystem here, and it's important to really lean in on this sort of proactive engagement. AXA is an autonomous vehicle software company based in the UK. We've got subsidiaries in Canada and the US, so we do have an international perspective when it comes to our go-to-market strategy. We are, as I said, a software company. We are developing software that is both domain and vehicle agnostic, meaning that our software platform is designed to safely drive a vehicle without a driver in a number of domains, many of which are already being deployed. So we've got a very significant customer demand in a lot of off-road use cases, so hub-to-hub logistics, airports, passenger shuttles around hospitals, shopping centres, etc., on semi-private routes, as well as some mixed public highway deployments. Why is insurance important to us? Well, it's not, for us, it's not just about risk management. Obviously, it's critical that we have insurance, not purely from a regulatory perspective, because it's a requirement, but also you know, for prudent risk management itself. But really, it's an enabler for our business, and I think we can bring quite an interesting perspective to this conversation, because as a software only solution, our go-to-market strategy is naturally predicated on partnering with other parties. So that would be typically at the very minimum an OEM for the vehicle base itself, a fleet operator. We will not be operating fleets of vehicles ourselves, and probably a number of other external parties, to not even consider all of the manufacturers of the various components that will go into these vehicles. So for us, fit for purpose, very future-looking insurance solutions that haven't to date been considered are going to be very important to enable our route to market, to make sure that we can scale, that we can continue to integrate with our partners, and that we can really bring this technology to market in a meaningful fashion. And being part of these conversations is really important, because we're co-creating for the future here. There is, and I know this conversation is going to be, you know, we're going to be pinned down on a few aspects of where we see, you know, the regulatory requirements at the moment, some indications that we're seeing out of the UK, for example, in terms of what future legislation might look like. In a nutshell, it's still evolving. So we have this really incredible opportunity at this point in time to help inform some of those decisions and make sure that we are part of the solution, to make sure that we all end up in the future that we hope to see in hopefully not too many years' time. So that's our perspective. Insurance is really important to us. I lead those conversations within AXA with our customers. with regulators, with our insurer partners, and it's very much a collaborative exercise.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that overview. Next, when we're talking about insurance and AVs, it's obviously critical to understand liability. We've talked about liability in human drivers for 100 years, but automated driving really brings new considerations. I would love to have a conversation if you know, each of you could describe how your organization is thinking about liability in the context of AVs. Russ, I'd love to start with you kind of from the public sector perspective. How are you all
Sure.
looking at it?
Yeah, obviously it's a very complex and still relatively unknown. We're assuming a lot of things because this technology is not widespread yet. The legislation that Arkansas passed in 2020 talked about liability when it comes to, say, vehicles that have been converted into a autonomous vehicle. So it left out, or it said, liability was not going to be effective for the original manufacturer of that vehicle if it was converted. So that's one aspect of it. The other is, we're dealing with people that are doing the traditional driving with the steering wheel and that sort of thing, and then you've got the autonomous, which is more of a software issue. I was looking at an article that said that 94 or a very high percentage of auto accidents come from driver, the driver making a mistake or whatever, not from necessarily brakes or tires or whatever. But we're still dealing with vehicles that are going to have those specific things going on, maintenance type issues. And so while it might not be a driver, because there is no driver, maybe there's an issue with the fact that somebody forgot to maintain the brakes, or the tires were low, or something to that effect. So there's so many different variables out there when it comes to that. And I kind of echo what I think it was Tony that said that trying to unravel an accident and figure out who's liable for what and what was the cause of the accident is such a complex thing right now. And then you throw into the mix the possibility of cyber type situations where somebody might have hacked into one of these vehicles and caused something. Now, where does the liability lie? There's just a lot of things. And so, while we're at that, I guess it still feels like we're kind of at the very beginning of all of this, because it's not as widely used, at least here in the United States so far. So it's one of those things that's going to be ever evolving.
Yeah, I think you're right that we're at the beginning, and yet it's moving so fast. It's complicated. It's right. Tony, any comment on that from the industry perspective?
Sure. So we love states. We are a state regulated industry. We believe in state regulation. We also believe in state and local authority when it comes to things like registration and licensing, operation. We can let the feds play all day with performance and safety and what kind of parts should be in the FMVSS, right? But when these things are on the ground and how they actually work and the laws that they need to follow, that's all local, and it should stay that way. That's our sort of core, operating principle. And when you start there, then you also have to appreciate that the tort laws are different from state to state. And we think that the states should continue, and those things should evolve through state processes the way they always have. You asked about some of the liability questions. Okay, so let's say you have one of these with a human driver in it, and they have a last chance to veer left or right. Well, was the 5 seconds long enough to change liability? I don't know. You also have, Russ mentioned things like upkeep and maintenance. I don't know who that falls on in terms of liability when there's no driver there to change the tire every so many miles, right? Is it whoever built the truck? Is it whoever, can you get rid of that liability by hiring a service contractor and saying, hey, you have to service my trucks every so often, and if you don't do it, it's on you. And invariably, I am a recovering lawyer, unfortunately, and the lawyers are going to be heavily involved here. And they're going to say things like, well, how did you memorialize the transfer of liability? right? Who signed a piece of paper saying, I'm playing with it with my joystick back at headquarters and I'm controlling it, but I'm not liable. The company is liable, or whoever built that part that went wrong was liable. Oh, I got a piece of paper here that says it. I don't know how those are going to hold up. I'm sure Michael have some views on that, on how valid that's going to be, but and Rebecca probably as well from the experience. But those are some of the things that we're starting to think through as an insurance industry when we say, okay, well, we're going to be covering these cars, and we're going to be covering the people that are involved in crashes with these cars.
Yeah, and Mike, I'd love to bring it. You mentioned obviously data and video monitoring. Could you talk a little bit about that relationship? What access do insurance companies have to that kind of data collected in AVs?
Yeah, so as a start, I think it would be good for the people in the audience to recognize that we're actually talking about two different types of vehicles. So people use the term autonomous a little too loosely. So right now we are experiencing a lot more growth in assisted driving, or what's called ADAS related features in cars, as opposed to autonomous or self-driving, which is the human beings not driving. There's a lot more technology out there that is already being used that really impacts liability and insurance scenarios through ADAS operations. So for instance, the minute, I'll just use one company by name, but not to pick on them. The minute a Tesla has an accident, provided it's in the right cell zone, meaning there's cell coverage, data is transferred, and the accident has to be significant enough, but the data is transferred almost immediately from the accident, from the car to a cloud, and that includes the video and the data associated with the event. Not just 5 seconds. We're not talking about what's called black box data, or more technically speaking, what's called EDR data. EDR data is very limited. It's 5 seconds long and only captures about 20, 30 signals. By contrast, this automotive data that I'm referring to is recorded at thousands of a second, and it's recording things that human beings would not know, like what was the car thinking, what systems were in place, why was the car reacting the way it was, and the insurance industry is very quickly starting to figure out that the data and the video about those events are incredibly important. But even more significantly now, customers are able to access their own data under the data privacy laws, and they can request that data, and they get it in about an hour or so. So picture the customer showing up to the claim reporting stage and already has video and data belonging to this accident. And a lot of them will say, not my fault, and have either a convenient memory, or they really don't understand what happened. And sometimes we can see in the data on thousands of a second basis when the car did something wrong, or when the consumer says, I was doing this and they really weren't. And what we do is we marry the video and the data together to create this accurate representation of what took place. And it's really changing the dynamics of what happens in the claims process. And as we further evolve down this pathway, where a lot of the fights or we'll call risk transfer, but they're really fights between insurance companies and sometimes the plaintiff bar, is things like driver versus driver. Who ran the stop sign? Who had the red light? Who made the move left of center? Those things are all right now a verbal account that's reported to the police. The police write it down. Very rarely do they get it right. And a lot of times it's all based on subjective evidence. So this is going to eliminate the need for police to write those narratives. It's going to eliminate the need to interview these people to a large degree. It is going to cut down on fraud, and it will eliminate a lot of questionable liability claims that insurance companies find themselves in, where they feel like they have to pay a claim just to avoid litigation. So again, when I said it's data, and it's really important to understand that this data is out there now. Even in plain old cars, if your car has a camera behind the windshield and right behind usually the rear view mirror, it's recording data. And those cameras, many cars now, somewhere between 8 and 14 cameras, are recording data. So you can take that data and address all the problems that Russ talked about, and it also can protect those people that make these components, and promote safety from the standpoint of what was working, what wasn't. And I'll just end with this one point. The question, and I see it's later on in some of the questions you're going to ask, are these vehicles safe enough? The best way to determine whether or not a car is safe is to look at when the technology doesn't work. And in the automotive industry, in the engineering circles, that's called an edge case. Well, the ultimate edge case is when a car has an accident. Not when the car might have thought something went wrong, but something actually did go wrong. So I'll stop there. But the best use case to determine safety and interplay between technologies is to look at the data that's going through the vehicles on a nanosecond basis.
Very, very interesting. Yeah, thanks, Mike. In most of this, obviously, has been kind of talking about how the U.S. has been looking at this issue. So, Rebecca, would love to bring you in on this. Last fall, King Charles announced his proposal for an AV bill to establish a new legal framework for AVs in the UK. Curious what you can tell us about that proposal and specifically how it looks at this issue of liability.
Of course. Yes. So the AV bill announced in 2023 was a huge milestone for the UK autonomous vehicle ecosystem, really making it quite apparent how far this sector has come and how rapidly it's evolving. Certainly, we've seen a really high level of engagement by the insurance sector post that announcement. What that AV bill is looking to ultimately work towards is some kind of defined liability across different parties. We expect to see that probably in 2025 to 2026 in the UK. It's very clear that the passenger in the vehicle, because they would be a passenger in an autonomous vehicle, and I want to make clear I'm not speaking about ADAS here, just for pure transparencies, and also not to get into that very grey area, as Mike quite correctly pointed out. That's highly nuanced. When we're talking about a fully autonomous vehicle requiring no manual interaction, it's very clear that the passenger will not be liable for an incident. The next step is starting to map out which respective party might be, to whom liability is assigned. Today, looking at AV deployments, really from a liability perspective, they're customized in terms of the risk relationship between the parties, and the risk attribution tends to be defined on a contract by contract basis. That is international. That is not a UK only feature. That's very much how these things are playing out at the moment. It is a commercial negotiation. In the case of a commercial AV microtransit system, for example, the parties that typically have to agree on risk share will tend to be the self-driving software supplier, the vehicle manufacturer, a service operator, and probably also a service owner. A lot of the time in the US, of course, that's a public body. It will be the same in the UK as well. There is a distinction between the legal responsibility to a safety regulator and how that contractual risk is apportioned at the moment, because we are in somewhat of a vacuum when it comes to formal crystallization of liability. So that is somewhat case by case. It's obviously very complex, so it's something that does need to be crystallized as soon as possible. That's the liability. Just to be clear, probably for today's conversation as well, it's worth mentioning there is a difference between insurance solutions and ultimate legal liability, because that doesn't get too wedded to subrogation where that's relevant. If you're talking purely about an insurance solution, that is a different conversation about what the future fit for purpose insurance solution looks like. And agreed with Mike's comment around the the ambiguity around insurer responsibility is something that we want to avoid as a sector in the autonomous vehicle ecosystem. We do not want to be creating an environment where the insurance space is not comfortable. We want to make that as clear as possible. Data will help enormously with that. These vehicles have a 360-degree field of vision, depth of vision over 3 American football pitches. They have LiDAR, they have radar, they have, they are able to see and perceive much better than a human driver. Data is rich. It's a naturally data-rich environment. There actually should be no dispute over what happened. I think that's agree entirely with Mike. There will not be lengthy conversations if people are willing to share data. There won't be lengthy conversations about what happened. That will be immediately obvious from the moment the incident happens. Then it comes down to whether the insurance pays out. Of course, absolutely critical that it does. What does that insurance solution look like? It's probably not the traditional model. We need to be looking at a systems thinking approach to this solution, looking at a holistic approach to risk, a single insurer ensuring an autonomous vehicle deployment irrespective of the cause of the loss, for example. And then, of course, you have the absolute legal liability, which sits behind the insurance solution. So that's how we're looking at it as OXO. We're not alone in that. It's acknowledged to be the forward-looking approach to insurance, obviously acknowledging that the liability needs to be established as well. And these are conversations that are very much live, very much ongoing, huge level of engagement from the insurance space internationally. So that's where we stand, and that's our perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Really interesting perspectives. I just want to very quickly plug that Pave UK is launching next Wednesday, February 21st in London. So we were really grateful for the incredible forward-thinking approaches of the UK. Want to turn it back. I'd love to hear from Russ and Tony and Mike about sort of how that differs from the approach that the US, so the framework in the US. Any of you want to address that?
I'll hop in. I think it's important to remember not only the primacy of states when it comes to this stuff, but traffic codes. Traffic codes all around the country are built on an understanding that the person behind the wheel is performing dynamic driving tasks. A lot of the sort of proposed legislation, whether it's testing like they have in Arkansas, whether it's sort of, long flat roads that we've seen in places like South Dakota, Mississippi. We didn't have an AV bill here in Kentucky this session. A lot of them talk about dynamic driving tasks, and they're focused on what we sort of think is the wrong thing, right? It's not whether something is capable of being safe. It's whether it's been demonstrated being safe. So when you talk about the differences, I think the fact that there is no national traffic code is probably a big part of it. And honestly, I could see, we already are seeing ADAS works really well in some places and not in others. I think as we get to level 4s and level 5s, okay, you're really, really good at going on a long, straight stretch of highway from the Walmart distribution center to the store. Now, what are you going to do when that store is 3 feet in 3 feet of snow in Bismarck, North Dakota, where there are no straight roads and everything is curvy and windy, right? Those are those edge cases that Mike's talking about to some extent, but I think there's just a lot more to think through. And in one other thing that was triggered as we were answering the previous question is, I'm wondering also if what the effect of all of this is going to be on the claims process, because as Mike's talking about, like, oh, we have some certainty around claims. I'm sure Russ's claims complaint division would love to have a lot fewer complaints about my car, my crash was caused by the other guy, when we can say, well, here's the data.
Absolutely. Good point. We've had a lot of mentions. Everyone's been mentioning kind of, and I'm to my kind of clarifying for obviously is always has to be a part of every conversation, the difference between truly autonomous vehicles and driver assist features. Russ wanted to kind of just continue on that conversation about ADAS a little bit. Both ADAS and AV technology are evolving really quickly. How are state governments keeping up with the technology? Is like we've said, it really changes how we need to look at policy. What does that look like from the state perspective?
Yeah, I will say that the National Association of Insurance Commissioners is a great resource for us because I mean we are the NAIC, the regulators are, but they have a lot of resources when we get together and collaborate on things like big data and cyber and property and casualty with obviously autonomous vehicles and that sort of thing. There's a lot of information from multiple sources from multiple states that we use to kind of determine what direction we need to go, what we need to focus on when it comes to what insurance companies look like they're going to be doing. It's an interesting hybrid because we talk a lot about the departments of transportation who would be regulating the actual vehicles. We're looking at what the insurance companies are going to do and how they're going to react to this new technology and that sort of thing. So from that standpoint, we're a little bit on the outside when it comes to the technology aspect of it, but the insurance regulators and the departments are really good at collaborating with each other regarding things that are happening that are new, things that they're seeing in their states, and that sort of deal. So that's kind of how we do it. And obviously, too, trade groups like NAMIC and other trade groups, and then different conferences that we go to, things like Pave, that sort of stuff is all very good and helps us keep tabs on where this is going.
Interesting. Thank you. That's fascinating. Mike, one more question about data we've gotten from the audience. In terms of driver assistance, from the data that's collected from, like you said, most cars have cameras. What do we know about safety or the potential risks of cars with ADAS technology versus human drivers not using assistance technologies? Do you have any?
I have some thoughts on that, Tara, if you want. So a nice organization to pay attention to is the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. And they study things like how effective certain technologies are. And when we get into these higher end technologies, there's a lot of stuff that is pretty easy to understand. Backup cameras and backup warning systems. So IIHS says that's a clear winner. The data shows that this has dramatically decreased the number of accidents and the severity in those accidents. They're just beginning to pay attention to things like lane keeping assist and traffic aware cruise control, or what some people will call autopilot. Another organization that's really on top of this stuff is MIT, and you've had Brian Reamer speak. And this is the other end of the spectrum. The more you use these technologies to drive down the road while you're in, I'll call it autopilot, because that's a term people understand, the longer you rely upon that, the more likely it is that you're not going to pay attention. You lull yourself into a false sense of security. And I'll add the last part. There's this really important dynamic to this whole discussion of human factors. So the manufacturers put in all the literature, and it's in some of these laws, including the UK law that's been talked about, that human beings are responsible to oversee the vehicle. It takes about 2 seconds for a person who's involved in any kind of an accident to start to size up the issue of, oh my God, I'm having a problem. This is a different event than I expected. And then to formulate a plan, that's even more time, and then to execute on that plan. So in many of these accidents, while the manufacturers, and I would say conveniently, say, this is not our problem, it's yours, you're responsible, they miss the point, intentionally or not, that human beings cannot do what's called a takeover response. They just can't. And if you add to that, that they're lulled into a false sense of security, more so. So we're going to, as we start to deal with legal liability, we're going to have to start to deal with the fact that human beings are not good safety drivers. And that's
Mm.
been borne out by a lot of good science. And so I'll end my point on that.
Really interesting. Rebecca, this is a question that came in from the audience, actually from the UK, so I wanted to address it to you. It asks, how far should information sharing be mandated through regulation between AV developers and insurers?
Yeah, it's a great question and something that we're working on, and will be part of the lobbying that our ecosystem will be doing with the regulator over the coming 12 months or so. That there is actually quite a significant appetite from people within the space that there is some kind of standardized level of minimum required data sharing, that there is not. The starting point is that it is not the desire of the ecosystem to share as little as possible. I think it's probably important to note that. The transparency is something that we all want very much for the benefit of everyone. The standardization and minimum requirements will be part of that conversation because, of course, it needs to be part of the conversation around building out a fit for purpose liability matrix. And starting to create future-proof regulations so that things like insurance can be built around that framework. So to date, there is nothing in terms of a standardization of minimum data sharing requirements. We certainly are working towards that being something that is implemented in due course. It's not a very straightforward answer because obviously there's a lot of conversation around how long data needs to be kept, what level of data needs to be kept from a pure kind of data storage perspective. The depth of data collected on these vehicles every second, it far exceeds anything that would be useful or usable in the event of wanting to build defensibility or in order to kind of promote transparency. There is far more data than is required. So defining what is actually necessary and usable is part of that process, which is why it's the conversations have some time really. They need to run their course a little bit further. It's not we have more data than is usable as an ecosystem. So it's defining what is useful and then what everyone needs to be mandated to share.
That's really interesting. Tony, wanted to ask you kind of a forward-looking question. We're talking about where we are now, but what is the insurance industry doing to address the needs of AV companies over the next 2, 5, 10 years?
I think it's research. I think, when Mike talks about IIHS, wholeheartedly support them. Our members are very active there. I know they are also in touch with regulators and have had them out to the Vehicle Research Center, where they actually have developed ways to crash cars and test them. And, things like seatbelts and airbags, all of that came about because of the insurance industry.
Right.
And I think AVs, we will go along largely the same path. Like, we want to promote the safety and we want to create risk sharing mechanisms and risk transfer mechanisms that pass regulatory muster and that will enable AV companies to do more. I don't know how long that's going to take, candidly, because again, we want these to be demonstrated safe. We want them to be sharing roads responsibly with current policyholders. And as we talk about some of the things that Rebecca was just mentioning on data and meaningful data, and not just to recreate crashes, but to know how they're operating and what are they doing and what are they thinking and why are they making the decisions they make. A bunch of ones and zeros is not going to help an insurance company evaluate risk. Okay, they need there's a lot more specific and useful information for both consumers and carriers. It's one of the reasons NAMIC supports consumer ownership of all vehicle generated data. And then they can share it with us, they can share it with regulators, they can share it as they see fit. But we just don't think that the OEMs should own the data that's generated by a vehicle, particularly an advanced vehicle, an ADAS vehicle, or eventually an autonomous. That should belong to whoever bought the car.
Yeah. Very interesting. Actually, Russ, wanted to ask you one other, you had made reference to Walmart and some of the autonomous deliveries happening in your state there. Is there any, are you looking at all at autonomous trucks differently than passenger cars? We talk at Pave a lot about how likely the first exposure that a lot of people will have to autonomous technology here in the US is through trucking. How do you distinguish between those, if at all?
I mean, right now, that's really the only thing that we see in Arkansas are the trucks. We just don't have a large, if any, population of autonomous, passenger vehicles. So, the legislation that the legislature passed in 2020 centered around commercial use, and it didn't. I don't think it even mentioned personal use because that's just not something that's going on. Now they do have a pilot program that's available that if a company did come in and want to do that, there are certain things that guidelines that they would have to have. So nothing is keeping the personal passenger auto from coming in. It's just right now they're looking at the trucks. So
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Mike, one final question. I love, part of what we love to do at Pave is, like we said, bring in the public sector and private sector and kind of help to convene those conversations. From your perspective in the private industry, like what do you see would be helpful in bringing all these parties together? What, what communication, we've talked about data sharing. What do you think can help to push this conversation forward?
Yeah, I think we need an organization, and maybe it's an already established organization, but an organization where it brings in all the different stakeholders, enlightened by what Rebecca's brought to the conversation. There are some automakers that are like, you're not getting my data, and if you do, you have to pay for it. So that may be dated. But I think we need all stakeholders, police officers, some at the federal level, the NTSB, and say, okay, how do we look at legal liability? How do we look at insurance? But how do we look at standards? What are the standards for that data? And it has to be global. So for instance, there's been a lot of work in the last few years by the Society of Automotive Engineers on improving what's called the black box. Again, it's a small device. It doesn't capture nearly the data that I've been talking about. It's 5 seconds of data. In the European Union, the United Nations is involved. China's involved. They're advocating for 30 seconds of data. So just the time frame for how long data is captured in a more or less obsolete device is a battleground. So I think we need to bring in stakeholders from all these constituents. In the United States, automobiles are regulated by federal regulators, and insurance companies are regulated at the state level. We haven't talked about the police. We haven't talked about the plaintiff bar and the judges. So we need to bring these stakeholders in and start to talk about how to develop standards, because without that, we're not going to be able to develop public policy behind these concepts. So I think that's a really important part, to start forming an organization or several organizations where real hard work gets done. I'll point out that the new UK law came about by a 4-year study of the UK Law Commission. Think about how much work went into that. And that law, or it's not law, it's just a bill right now. It's going to take another year of vetting in the UK. So there's a lot of work to be done. And as I said in another forum about a month ago, we keep talking about how important that is, but we better start working on it now. And it's going to hold back the advancement of safe technology if we don't get this part of it right.
For sure. That is such a good point, Mike. And it's interesting to think both that, this takes a long time to do, but then also, in that 4 years, how much changes. So it's like things are changing in real time as you're doing this work and these studies. We are sadly out of time. I wish we could continue this for another hour, because what a great conversation with all of you had such thoughtful comments, and we will need to keep this conversation going. So thank you all so much for your time today and your contributions to this conversation. Thank you to our audience for joining us. We will share the video of this panel, and you can get more information at our website, pavecampaign.org. Thank you all so much for joining today.